Welcome to the Scientific Sense podcast, where we explore emerging ideas from science, policy, economics, and technology. My name is Gill Eapen. We talk with world's leading academics and experts about their recent research or general areas of topical interest. Scientific Sense is an unstructured conversation with no agenda or preparation. We cover a wide variety of domains where new discoveries are made and new technologies are developed on a daily basis. We are most interested in how new ideas affect society and help educate the world how to pursue a rewarding and enjoyable life rooted in science, logic, and information. We seek knowledge without boundaries or constraints and provide unedited content of conversations with researchers and leaders who love what they do. A companion blog to this podcast can be found at scientificsense.com, and this podcast is available on over a dozen platforms and directly at scientificsense.net. If you have suggestions for topics, guests, and other ideas, please send them to info@scientificsense.com, and I can be reached at gill@eapen.info. My guest today is Professor Andrew Newberg, who is Professor of Integrative Medicine and Nutritional Sciences at Thomas Jefferson University. He has been involved in a number of neuroimaging research projects, which have included the study of aging and dementia, epilepsy, and other neurological and psychiatric disorders. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on the program.
Yeah, thanks for doing this. So our conversation today is a bit different from
I'm used to
that. What you typically do in neurology and diseases. And I want to set the context by starting with your 2009 paper entitled Religious Experience, Psychology and Neurology. You say religion has served as a virtual influence on the lives of humans since the beginning of modern man, and a plethora of practices incorporate people's ongoing quest to be closer to what they perceive as God. Religious experiences, particularly those that are transformative, have often been described as involving an alteration in the usual sense of consciousness. I have to say up front, Andrew, so that the audience knows my bias. I'm an agnostic. I'm generally skeptical of experiences, and so I want to obviously get your perspective, and we have a number of different experiments here that we can talk about. But before we get into the details, could you sort of set the context for the psychology and neurology of religious experiences?
Sure. Well, as you were just saying, I mean, obviously, if one looks at human history, to me, there are kind of two main forces that have shaped it. One is the science and technology side, and the other is the religious and spiritual side. And certainly, again, if you go back to even the earliest evidences that we have of human activity in terms of burials with, flowers and shells and weapons and things like that, there's this sense that there's something beyond what we just are biologically. And that obviously starts to lead us down this path towards something that seems spiritual or religious. I would venture to guess that there has never been any civilization in human history that has arisen without some type of religious or spiritual elements to it. Many times the leaders of a given civilization or empire are considered to be descended from gods or something like that. So there's certainly a lot for us to think about in the context of the impact that religion and spirituality has had on human history. So, here we are now in the 21st century where we have brain scans and we have the ability to look at our biology in a completely different way, to be able to look at these kinds of topics anew and try to look at them not just purely from a kind of philosophical or theological perspective, arguing over, what does a sacred text say? What does the Bible say? What do the Upanishads say, or whatever? But what can we actually understand if we use a scientific lens to explore what religious experiences are? Can we try to understand them better in terms of what people even mean by them, what happens to people when they have them? And then you get into a lot of fairly practical questions about how religious and spiritual attitudes and beliefs affect a person's psychology in terms of their emotions, their emotional set points. Do people turn to religion as a form of coping? Does it make people more depressed, less depressed? You can look at it, again, certainly from both the positive and negative, which I'm sure we'll talk about. And then with the advent of brain imaging, the ability to try to explore this from an even a more of a neurological or a neurophysiological perspective in terms of what's really going on in the brain when people say, I've had some kind of spiritual experience, and how does it affect the brain? Does it change the way the brain operates? Does it change the way we look at reality, the way we think about things? So, whether you are a profoundly religious individual or a very staunch atheist, we have to acknowledge that religion has played an incredibly prominent role in human history. So taking a good look at it using science, I think, has value to it. And again, depending on where one decides to take it, there are some fascinating possibilities in terms of how we ultimately use this information. In my view, this intersection of science and religion, which some people refer to as neurotheology as a term, we have the ability to look at this intersection to really help us understand who we are as human beings, both in terms of how we've gotten to where we are and where we ultimately are going as we go forward. And do we need religion and spirituality? Do we not? Do we, how does it blend with science, or shouldn't it? So really fascinating. Every one of those questions, there's a brain behind that question that's asking it and thinking about it in different ways. And that's what all of this is about, which is trying to understand how our brains engage all of these questions. If you believe, if you don't believe, your brain is doing something to help you do that. And then try to understand that becomes really relevant, I think, for understanding how we function as human beings.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating area. And like you say, we have enough tools and we can apply some scientific process to it to at least ask those questions. We may not find answers that are acceptable to everybody,
right?
But it'll be interesting data. Religion, as you say, continues to be a major force. I don't know the exact numbers. I would imagine of the 8.5 billion people that we have worldwide, at least 2/3 of them would be considered religious.
Probably something like that.
Yeah. And so it is meaningful to a very large percentage of the population. And like you mentioned before, I sometimes think about the origin or the sort of the incentives for religions to start and flourish. And I want to get your perspective on it. One thing I think about is, humans are given a very harsh constraint, and that's lifespan.
Right.
And, when you die, it seems so final. And so, I would imagine right from the beginning, people looked for some ways to extend that. And I wondered if religion started, as a process to do that. Do we have any data on that?
The actual evolutionary origins of religion is actually a very intriguing debate. I think there are a number of possible explanations that people have offered, and you mentioned one of them, which is to sort of help human beings deal with the finality of death and what that means. I think that certainly when you get to some of the conceptual aspects of religion in terms of what happens to us as human beings and what happens to us when we die, certainly becomes part of that. Part of our argument and part of the discussion in the paper that you mentioned about religious experience is that we find that so many people have religious experiences or spiritual experiences at various stages of their life, sometimes as a child, sometimes as an adult. Sometimes they do coincide with, near-death type of experiences, but often they can happen in a variety of circumstances. And so those experiences in and of themselves also seem to have some influence on the origins of religion. I mean, people are feeling something, and then they're trying to interpret what that experience means and trying to define it and codify it in some kind of way. And I'll even add several other scholars have suggested that that religion ultimately provides a kind of moral structure for civilizations to arise. Provides various approaches to creating a cohesive society, which may have an adaptive advantage for human beings. And one of the arguments that my late colleague Jean DeQuilly and I made, actually in one of our first books called Why God Won't Go Away, we said, the brain has two very basic functions for us. And these are more kind of euphemistically speaking, that, one of them is self-maintenance, we said, which is it helps us to survive. It helps us to get through the world and helps us to stay alive and put off death as much as we can. And the other aspect of our brain is what we call self-transcendence. And what that means is that our brain has this remarkable ability to grow and adapt, so that, even though we're, 50 years old or 80 years old, we're, on one hand, we're still the same person we were when we were 5 years old, but our brain has developed and evolved and changed, within ourselves, so that we constantly are able to adapt to the world, to change as we learn things, and to move from one stage of life to the next. And the first one, the self-maintenance, is about maintaining the self. And so the more we have an ability to understand and control and regulate ourselves and regulate our environment, the more likely we are to survive. So now, if you then turn to what religions do for us, well, they also help with self-maintenance and self-transcendence. They help us to maintain ourselves, as you were mentioning. They give us some directionality in life. They may help us to create cohesive societies. They may provide us a sense of morals. They may help us to quell some of what some of my colleagues have referred to as ontological anxiety about what happens when we die. And if you do look at some of the ancient traditions, it basically, they give you kind of a framework by which to live your life, what to eat, what to do, how to work, how to select mates and so forth. So there's a lot of self-maintenance elements within religion. And of course, religion in many ways provides the ultimate expression of self-transcendence, which is, can we, as human beings, get to something better than we are? And obviously religion sometimes, or often we'll take that to something supernatural. But, if, when you talk about various Buddhist or Hindu ideologies, it's not necessarily so much about a soul going up to heaven or something like that, but can we kind of transcend ourselves to get to a different kind of state of consciousness, a different state of being that is, that has value to us. So, our argument was that as long as religion is trying to kind of help us with self-maintenance and self-transcendence, that the brain, really kind of maps well onto what religions try to do for people. So, in the grand scheme, I think there are a number of possibilities out there that may help us to understand what could arguably be an evolutionary basis of why religion is here and has such an influence on human beings. And of course, to just throw out the one last possibility, at least at the moment, is that, if you are a deeply religious individual, you would say, well, of course it's in the brain. It would be kind of silly if there was God up in heaven and us down here and we had no way of perceiving God. So no matter whether you are, again, religious or not, there are a lot of different explanations as to how and why religion may have gotten into the human brain, so to speak.
Yeah. So I was wondering, Andrew, I don't know if it's even possible, but do we have any data on sort of the thinking about the neurological basis? So do we have any data in sort of architecture, structure of the brain that shows some differences between religious people and non-religious people? Well,
there have been some interesting studies that have looked at that question in a lot of different kinds of ways. One of the things I talk about in the context of this field of neurotheology is that it's really a big jigsaw puzzle in a lot of ways, and there are a lot of pieces to that puzzle. So, for example, here's one answer to your question, which is that studies have shown that people who are engaged in religious practices, and specifically more spiritually oriented practices like meditation or yoga, that their brains are actually different than those people who are not doing those practices. And some of the data at the moment shows that certain areas of the brain, for example, the frontal cortices, are larger, are physically larger in those people who do these practices over and over again throughout their lifetime. Now, does that have some implications for us? Well, to a certain extent it does. We know that the frontal lobe is involved in our attentional network, so it helps us with concentration and attention. It also helps to regulate emotional responses by regulating the limbic system. So if you are an active meditator as part of a spiritual tradition, then you are likely to have a variety of changes that go on in the brain that help you to arguably function better. You may be able to concentrate better. You may be able to regulate emotional responses like anxiety and depression more effectively. And in that context, again, there is some evidence for that. Another approach to asking that question has been to look at how human beliefs form. And a couple of interesting studies, one done by a very prominent atheist, Sam Harris, looked at religious and spiritual beliefs and compared them to beliefs about other things and found that they really weren't that much different in terms of brain function and brain structure. So it seems that whether you believe in being, if your political beliefs lean Democratic or Republican, those beliefs are in your brain in much the same way that religious and spiritual beliefs might be in your brain. They affect a lot of the same basic areas of your brain. There's also some very interesting studies that have looked at brain disorders. So, for example, a very interesting study of individuals who have injury to certain parts of the brain, particularly in the form of like brain tumors, have found that those people who have brain tumors that are primarily in the parietal region are more likely to express feelings of self-transcendence. And, that's kind of interesting, especially in the context of what I was just talking about, the sense of self-transcendence that people have. But also what that suggests is that those religious and spiritual beliefs may have something to do with the different parts of our brain and how they work when they are working normally versus how they work when they are working in a quote unquote abnormal way. So there are some really, and then some people have also done some more psychological studies designed to look at whether people who are religious, address questions in the same way. Are they more likely to search for patterns in things that don't really exist? Are they, more likely to be critical thinkers or non-critical thinkers? And the data there is very interesting because, some studies, especially those that have been done by individuals who are who are not particularly religious, are sometimes trying to show that people who are religious aren't as intelligent or don't have critical thinking skills. And sometimes when they've given them certain logical problems, people who are religious don't do as well as non-religious individuals. But on the other hand, when studies are done to take into consideration the person's beliefs to begin with, meaning that they ask questions that are geared towards religion or spirituality, other studies have shown that religious individuals can be every bit as rational or as critical in terms of their thought processes. And if anybody has spent an evening with a theologian, they will find that they are incredibly adept at thinking and thinking through problems, even though they ultimately have some fundamental belief that kind of goes beyond just the pure critical thinking processes. So a lot of really interesting ways of trying to get at that question. And as you can see in my answer, there's a lot of really complex ways of looking at it, and we don't really have a defined answer at this point, especially because the last thing I'll say on it is that many studies have looked at kind of larger populations. So they may find that religious people are more likely to have, higher, larger frontal lobes or something like that. But that doesn't mean that everyone who's religious is that way. And it doesn't mean that everyone who's atheist is another way. There are many factors that get into the equation in terms of why someone ultimately decides to believe things the way they do.
Right. Yeah. No, I was just thinking there had to be some selection advantages. So if religion acted as sort of a stress reducer, for lack of a better term, right from the beginning, it would have acted as a sort of selection advantage. And evolutionarily, as you said before, we don't see many cultures without religion. And even now, we don't see many cultures without religion. And so, you mentioned yoga and meditation, but I wondered, both yoga and meditation, I think, have become sort of commercialized and, taken out of the religious context anymore. It's more in the area of exercise.
Right. Well, absolutely. They've been secularized and made more accessible to people, which, on one hand is great. It's wonderful that lots of people can do yoga or do meditation and mindfulness and other types of practices that help them to reduce their stress or help them to feel better. But obviously, a lot of them grew out of some type of spiritual tradition, and there is that underlying piece to it about working towards something, some kind of enlightenment state or something along those lines.
And I saw a paper, Andrew. I don't know if this is really peer-reviewed or real data, but claiming that there is some structural differences between liberals and conservatives in the U.S., for example. And you touched on that, and it sort of goes in the same direction, right? I also wondered, I don't have any data on this, but I speculate that there has to be some sort of negative correlation, strong negative correlation between academics and religious beliefs. Have you seen any data?
Well, we certainly know that, as a group, people who are in academia tend to be less religious. So, that certainly seems to be the case. The question then becomes is why, what are the elements behind that lead to that? And, going this line of discussion about evolution is a very interesting one because we always have to remember that part of what guides evolution is the environment. And so, what is influencing the genetics and the adaptability that you're seeing? So, for example, like a really interesting example in the United States, which has, historically been very pro-religious, being a religious person has generally been a pretty good thing. And so a lot of research studies, certainly, going back into the 1960s and 70s, showed that those people who are religious tend to do better than people who are non-religious. But those same data do not hold in countries or cultures where religion is not highly valued. So, for example, in communist countries like the Soviet Union, when that was there, or in China, being a religious person comes with a lot of extra stressors, and you're trying to hold on to a religion in the face of something that is not very well respected and may even get you into trouble. So there's a lot to be said about where does it become adaptive or not adaptive, and how that may be influenced in terms of the environment itself, and whether that has something to do with academics as well. We don't know for sure. It's always a challenge to try to figure out, all those different pieces that go into influencing things. But yeah, trying to think about whether or not it is adaptive and how it is adaptive and when it is adaptive are interesting questions that certainly, this to me is a very important area where neurotheology itself as a field, looking at this intersection between understanding the brain and religion might be really helpful at trying to sort of tease out where those differences are and try to tease out what, where those evolutionary forces may be playing a role in terms of the religious beliefs of a given individual or a given group of individuals.
Yeah, and there is clearly, some sort of a club effect or subscription effect when you hit a critical size. You are forced to conform. So like you said, in I don't know China that well, but being religious in China may be a difficult thing. But you don't have, too many people, right? So, but just to the south in India, if you're not religious, you are sort of left out.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and again, what is good is also up for grabs in terms of how we think about this. So you had mentioned like the liberal versus conservative brain. And I have seen some data starting to come out about that. And, one of the statements that I've seen is that, areas like the amygdala, one of the main areas that's involved in like fear response, tends to be kind of more active and larger in conservatives, and the idea that they're sort of like afraid of change and afraid of things. Now, that could be a good thing or a bad thing depending on the environment. If people really are, coming after you and trying to, create problems for you, then being afraid of that is protective. If you're living in a world where that level of fear becomes excessive and prevents you from engaging the world effectively and being part of a larger community, then it becomes negative and detrimental. And so, I guess the take-home point there is that it's, even though people who are religious may see the world differently, whether that is better or worse is also not really clear. And there can be times where it's great to be able to be really critical about things. There's times where it's great to be very realistic about things. There's times where it's great to be optimistic and unrealistic about things. If all of us were pessimistic and critical about everything, then, the Wright brothers would never have created an airplane, and we would have never gone to the moon. And, because people have said, that's ridiculous, you can't do that. So somebody had to say, let's go for it. And so, depending on the circumstances, everyone has to sort of think about what are the approaches that work best for them and in the context of the environment that they're in.
Yeah, and the phrase, only the paranoid survives, what was clearly useful 50,000 years ago in the African savannah, right? So I think in some sense, the context matters a lot. And we are given conditions now that is sort of an accumulation of all the selection advantages. And as you said, based on the environment that existed, but now we are in a position that is very different from what used to be. That makes it very interesting. I want to go into one of your recent papers entitled The Noetic Quality, a Multimethod Exploratory Study. You say religious, spiritual, and mystical experiences, RSMEs, are often described as having noetic quality or the compelling sense that the experience feels real. So you have a study here, 700 or so participants. You wanted to describe a bit what exactly you measured?
Well, the study really came out of a larger kind of exploration of the meaning of these experiences. And when we have always kind of gathered from our discussions with other people informally that when people have an intense spiritual or mystical kind of experience, there's one, there are many interesting qualities about it, but one of them in particular has to do with how real they feel. Because, it is interesting when you talk to somebody who, for example, is an atheist, will kind of not understand the meaning of what somebody who says, I had a religious experience, because they didn't have that experience. So, which is, completely understandable. For the person who has had that experience, they perceive it to be incredibly real. And that in and of itself is quite a fascinating thing, because, many times we all have this kind of ability to understand this concept. All of us have had dreams at one point or another. And no matter how real a dream feels, when you wake up from the dream, you typically relegate that to an inferior perspective of reality. You say that was just a dream. And if something was chasing you or whatever was going on, you kind of know that isn't the real reality. And now you're resting and you're living within the everyday reality, as I'll call it, which is just, getting up to work and going to jobs and having a family and all that. So what's fascinating is that when people have these kinds of religious experiences, on one hand, they kind of have this dream-like quality to them. However, when they no longer have the experience, what they don't say, that was less real. In fact, oddly enough, they actually think that it was more real than our everyday reality experience. So this raises some interesting questions for us on a very philosophical level, on an epistemological level, about how we as human beings decide to identify something as being real or not. And so, the study that you mentioned was actually derived from an online survey that we did, where we asked people to describe their most intense spiritual experiences. And we actually, ultimately, we had about 2,000 people who provided some kind of information about them. And, depending on how we were looking at the data, I think in the paper that you mentioned, we got down to about 700 people where we had like a complete set of information for that particular question that we were looking at. And when we asked them about the realness of the experience, again, it just supported what we kind of already had assumed, that if you ask people how real did it feel from less real to more real, 90% of people or more said that it felt more real than our everyday reality experiences. And I think, when you do get into this more philosophical questioning about the nature of reality and how human beings perceive that reality, this raises some very problematic issues for us, because ultimately, how do we know anything that we think about the world is real? Everything that we think about the world comes into us through our senses, and we hope that our visual and auditory senses and the ways we hear things and see things is accurate. So if I look outside and I see an automobile, hopefully there's really an automobile there. I could have schizophrenia and it could be a pure hallucination. And how would I differentiate that? So, what do we do when somebody says, that experience of reality that took me to a transcendent level and was something that enabled me to see the world in a different kind of way, that's really the real reality. It's common in Buddhist kind of thought process of, sometimes people go to as far as saying that this is an illusion. But, forgetting even that, that degree of a statement, the notion that there's some sort of more deeper fundamental reality is quite fascinating. Even in science, we understand that there is a deeper fundamental reality than the human world. There are atoms and molecules that we don't see, and they are the basis of everything that we do. But we also wouldn't say that, it was, my carbon atoms that decided to go to the grocery store and get some milk. We would say, I went to the grocery store to get some milk. And why I decided to get milk instead of orange juice, ultimately, those are my carbon atoms and nitrogen atoms all deciding to do that in some way. But, it's also me as a person. So it raises some really fascinating philosophical and scientific questions. And that's why, to me, I keep coming back to this neurotheology concept of, I don't know if we're going to answer those questions by purely looking at this from a scientific perspective. I don't think we're going to get to it purely by looking at it from a more religious or spiritual perspective. But maybe if we kind of combine these two perspectives, maybe we will get to an answer that we have never been able to get to before. I can't guarantee that, obviously, but I kind of hope that may be the possibility, that we blend our scientific investigation of these questions with our qualitative and subjective, our consciousness, if you will, experiences like that, and hopefully we will get to some deeper answers. But until then, we've got to keep asking questions.
Yeah. I mean, the situation could be worse, Andrew. There is a fringe technology that says we are living in a simulation.
Right.
The talk
well,
about
and the famous movie, The Matrix, and where is reality? And but look, I mean, we wrote a book called Why We Believe What We Believe, and we talk about our sensations and how we get things from the outside world, and our thoughts and our emotions as all influencing our beliefs. And we talk about all the studies that show how malleable we are, how influenceable we are, and how we can be fooled in so many different ways that it really, it really does make you have to challenge the things that you think about the world, whether it's a moral thought or a political thought or a religious or spiritual thought. Why do liberals think the way they do? Why do conservatives think the way they do? And how do either of them know that they're looking at the world the right way? How do any of us know what the president of the United States is really doing right now or really thinking about right now? None of us do. And we have access to such a small percentage of the universe, probably on the order, I try to calculate at one point, like 10 to the minus 57th percent is what we have access to of the entire universe. So how do we ever think that we know something about what's going on out there? It's remarkable that our brain helps us to see the world in some kind of consistent way, and convinces us that we actually do know the world and what's going on in it. So it's some fascinating issues for us to think about.
Yeah, I want to touch on one
Yeah.
thing in the paper, Andrew. So you mentioned this already. A majority of participants, close to 70%, reported their experience, their RSMEs, which is religious, spiritual, and mystical experiences, felt more real than their usual sense of reality. So that is one
Yeah.
interesting thing to think about. But you say participants who reported experiences as feeling more real used more language referring to connection, a greater whole, and certainty, things like love, or, and everything, and fewer first-person pronouns, cognitive processes, and things like that. I, me,
Right.
think, probably, and so on. And so that tells me that we talked a bit about the hardware, but there is a neurology perspective. There's a little bit of a difference there, but this also tells me that the process of thinking also appears
That's
to be
right.
slightly
Yeah.
different. Yeah.
We published a book called How Enlightenment Changes Your Brain, which kind of addresses your question very directly, that there are several specific elements of these kinds of experiences, and they really are different ways of thinking, as you said. So, you brought up one of the most important ones, which is this sense of connection, a sense of oneness, unity, whatever, however you want to define that. And that is this characteristic of these experiences, which is fundamentally different. I mean, people, it's always gets said so often in just kind of common language, people felt at one with, the universe, or at one with humanity, or whatever, or one with God, if you're a religious individual. And that sense of being at one with something, at being connected to something, is a very profound experience for these individuals. And it also feels incredibly real. So, again, it gets back to our earlier point that, normally we kind of go through our everyday world as feeling fairly separate from everything out there. And, it's me and you, and it's me and the car, and it's me and, another person. Whereas in these experiences, it is much more of a oneness, of a connectedness, of an interconnectedness. And that is part of what feels more real. So that when people no longer have that experience, they say, well, in that reality, we are all deeply connected. And we are able, through the studies the brain scan studies we've done, to look at what's going on in different parts of our brain. We've mentioned a little bit already, like frontal lobes and the limbic system. The limbic system is very involved in a lot of the emotional elements. You mentioned awe for a moment. But the parietal lobe in particular is an area that we've looked a lot at, which tends to bring in our sensory information and helps us to construct our spatial representation of ourselves and the world around us. And we hypothesized that during these experiences, and we observed this during practices like meditation and prayer, that the parietal lobe actually kind of shuts down, and we see decreased metabolism or blood flow in these areas on brain scans. So if this area normally turns on to give us our sense of self and differentiate that self from the world, if this area starts to shut down, we lose our sense of self, and we lose that differentiation between ourself and the world. And if people have an intense enough experience, it appears that they can feel, as if almost their entire self, their entire ego self goes away, and they perceive this incredible sense of oneness that is incredibly real. So it's quite fascinating for us to think about what that means in terms of where the real reality is.
It also seems to me, Andrew, that the experience requires certain conditions, and one of them is a desire to have the experience. And without that, I wondered if you will have them, right? So are we, if you take people and put them into two buckets, in one bucket are people who don't really have a desire. They're already rejected the possibility of an experience. Another bucket, you have people who already, sort of expecting that experience.
Well, yeah, I think that's a really interesting point too. And we've talked about this in some of our other works about beliefs. Certainly the prevailing belief system that you have is going to affect your ability to even have the experience or to interpret that experience after the fact. So, for example, you mentioned people who are not open to those experiences. What would happen to them? Now, interestingly, there are examples of people who are. In fact, I know a number of people who are atheists who have had, like a near-death experience and has, all the full-blown elements of it. And to them, ultimately, their conclusion was that was my brain dying. That was all in my brain. People may have a drug-induced experience, a psychedelic experience, and it's just my brain. And which is, again, totally appropriate and reasonable. And I remember one time I had kind of a funny interchange with a friend of mine who is very atheist in his thinking. And he said, look, if God existed, why doesn't God just come down, shake my hand and say, I'm here, and then I'll believe. And I said, no, you wouldn't. You would check yourself into a mental institution because your belief system initially is so strong that, it's like the old, Oh God movies or whatever, where it really becomes hard to ever accept that that's what's going on. On the other hand, as you mentioned, there are people who are very open to these kinds of experiences and may be more likely to have them. Now, one of the things that was interesting in our larger database that we had is that there are people who do just seem to literally, get hit by these experiences. They're not looking for them. They're not, in any kind of weird situation, a near-death experience or anything like that. They do happen. But I agree with you that, they are certainly far more likely to happen when people are purposely trying to work towards them, and when they have an underlying spiritual or religious perspective that they're looking at. Although, again, even in those individuals, a lot of times the experience itself is so radically different from anything that they've believed in the past that sometimes it's actually quite challenging for them to even know what to do with that experience. And almost it can become a negative for them, even when the experience is so positive. Right. That they have trouble integrating it into their prevailing belief system, or maybe they go to like a clergy member or family member who kind of, dismisses them. And so there's some really interesting pieces to all this. And again, I'll throw in the neurotheology pieces. Well, what is the difference? Are there certain brain changes that we have no choice but to accept as a certain level of reality, or are we always able to alter the way in which we think and modify the ways in which we interpret whatever experiences we have? And I don't know, but it's a fascinating question.
Yeah. Don't we see sort of the same process in psychedelics, those who can take advantage of it and those who cannot seem sort of, willing and not willing as sort of the primary differentiation?
So part of the interesting thing about that is that, in the studies that have been done looking at psychedelics, certainly, the early data suggests that many of the people, large majority of people who are given them specifically as part of research studies, will report very intense spiritual experiences. I haven't seen the data that you're specifically asking about, if you tried this on atheists and so forth, how that would change their ultimate interpretation of those experiences. But certainly they provide very compelling and very intense experiences that are very powerful for the people who have them. They can be transformative as well, which is a whole other important point about all these experiences. But let me just say one flip side of this, which is that, in our very westernized way of looking at things, we say, okay, the person took psilocybin, took magic mushrooms or whatever, and they had an experience. So clearly the experience was produced by the drug. And again, totally makes sense from a scientific perspective. However, there is another perspective, and, one could, have some very fascinating arguments over this. But for a shaman who takes a magic mushroom and then has a spiritual experience, they don't view that as inauthentic or artificial. They view that as the doorway, if you will, into looking at the world in a different kind of way and into a more real kind of way. And the best analogy that I always kind of say to people is, I wear glasses. So when I wake up in the morning, the world is a very blurry place. And then I put my glasses on and I see the world clearly. Now, the world didn't change and I didn't change, but, I see the world differently because I've modified the way in which I perceive the world. So who is to say that when you rev up a brain on serotonin and dopamine and so forth, that you're actually now able to see the world and whatever, sensory stimuli and so forth in the right way instead of the way in which we currently see it? Because clearly we know that we don't see, 90% of what's going on around us. We only see the visual light spectrum, and there's all kinds of radio waves and other light waves that are coming in, X-rays and ultraviolet and infrared and all that. We don't see any of that stuff. So, it doesn't mean that doesn't exist, but what would happen if you could somehow put on glasses in a way that would help you to see the world differently? So who's to say that a drug-induced state doesn't somehow connect you to a world in a different kind of way? Again, it's a really intriguing scientific as well as philosophical question. And part of what I always just try to let people know is that they have to be careful about the biases that they bring in to the initial discussion. And we all always have to be careful about whatever conclusions we draw from whatever research studies that we're looking at. So, I'm not here to say that, psychedelics do get you to that different state of the world, or it is just a brain phenomena, but, those are some interesting possibilities for us to talk about.
Yeah. We'll take a quick break, Andrew. When we come back, we'll talk about that exactly, whether dopamine or serotonin, those types of drugs
Sounds good.
could have an impact.
This is a Scientific Sense podcast providing unscripted conversations with leading academics and researchers on a variety of topics. If you'd like to sponsor this podcast, please reach out to info@scientificsense.com.
So we're back. Andrew, we were talking about religious, spiritual, and mystical experiences, RSMEs, and how real they could be for some people and maybe not so real for others. But it depends very much on the person, their background, and the way that they think. Could be other aspects to it. You have a study here, effect of a 1-week spiritual retreat on dopamine and serotonin transporter binding, a preliminary study. So, this is a situation where you actually have an experiment running, and then you're measuring what that experiment did in these two things, right?
Correct.
So
yes.
Yeah. So what did you find?
Oh, sure. Sorry, I wasn't sure if you were going to ask something else. What we did was, as you said, we sent people through a very intensive spiritual retreat program. It was actually a Christian-based program derived from what are referred to as the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius, who is the founder of the Jesuit movement in Christianity. And there's a center that's near where we are in the Philadelphia area. So we would send people to there for a week-long program. It involves a lot of contemplation, prayer. Most of it is done in silence. There is a lot of, however, there are times where they speak with a kind of spiritual advisor, if you will, and reflect on a lot of aspects of their own life and their own beliefs. So it's a pretty immersive kind of experience. And what we did was we scanned their brain before and after. And as you said, we did several different scans, but one of the ones that we looked at were changes that occur in the dopamine and serotonin system. And so we actually did a kind of scan called a SPECT scan that involves injecting a small amount of a radioactive tracer that actually goes to the serotonin and the dopamine transporters, which are receptors in the brain that take up excess serotonin and dopamine after a synaptic transmission. And the idea is that it gives you a sense as to kind of where your serotonin and dopamine systems are in terms of how much they're acting or what they're doing. So we actually found something that was quite intriguing to me and not what I expected to see per se. There have been some studies that have shown, for example, that meditation practices cause a release of dopamine in the brain. And I had actually originally hypothesized that if you have excess dopamine, then typically you would have an upregulation of the dopamine transporter because it's trying to remove some of the excess dopamine from the area, from the synapse. So, however, we saw the opposite. Over the week-long retreat, when we scanned people when they came out of the retreat, their dopamine transporter activity, their dopamine transporter binding was lower. Now, this isn't, we can have some interesting scientific debates about that and trying to figure out exactly what might be going on. But I think the most likely explanation of that is that as a result of these practices, that it actually did change the way this dopamine transporter was functioning and that there was less of it. Now, what would that mean? Well, one possibility is that there's less and less dopamine in their system, and that is possible, although again, that seems a little unlikely because other studies have suggested that it goes up. Yeah. But the other possibility is that as you downregulate or as you decrease, I should say, the dopamine transporter, what that means is that every time you have a dopaminergic release, you're going to have a stronger response by the postsynaptic receptors. To a large extent, this is kind of analogous to what happens when you take cocaine. Cocaine actually blocks the dopamine transporter, and so suddenly you get this flood of dopamine in the brain, and that is what causes the high, the euphoria.
So higher reward, right? Higher sensation of reward.
Yeah, exactly. It's part of the reward system of the brain. Yeah. Exactly. So arguably speaking, then, if they have a decrease in transporter binding and decrease in the dopamine transporter, then every time they have a release of the dopamine, it actually would sort of be perceived as more and more strongly. And I think this is an important point also because when you do think about these mystical experiences, spiritual experiences, there's a differentiation between experiences and practices. So just doing meditation or prayer by itself is not inherently a religious experience. The religious experience or the spiritual experience comes because you are doing that practice. And so the practice itself may alter the way the brain responds to dopamine in such a way that at some point when you kind of finally do have this incredible release of dopamine for whatever reason, that you do have this very intensive experience. And then again, we saw the same kind of response in the serotonin transporter. And that also makes sense because, as we were talking about a little earlier, the psychedelic drugs typically are involved in high levels of serotonin. So maybe this kind of artificially, I don't say artificially, but sort of mechanistically winds up resulting in higher responses to serotonin in the brain, almost on a more natural level, I should say, than the artificial way that you get with a drug. So this to me is very interesting. It gives us at least our first window into what's going on in the brain when people are doing these practices. And we can ask kind of the next question, which is, well, what would happen if you were, a nun or a monk who are doing these practices and doing these kinds of programs, for hours a day for a lifetime, and how that will change the way your brain operates?
Yeah, let me ask you a loaded question.
Okay.
So if this mechanism is right, you would find addiction to spiritual retreats, right? Mm-hmm. we see, this sort of mass hysteria sometimes in different parts of the world.
Yeah.
That could actually get addicted to retreats, I would imagine.
Well, there's some, the discussion about addictions and spirituality is really something that is very interesting. As you said, certainly people can become attached to religious traditions or even cult-like behavior, which has a lot of elements that are overlapping. And of course, the flip of this is that a number of therapeutic interventions, such as Alcoholics Anonymous, for example, really invoke a kind of spiritual elements to them. They talk about believing in a higher power and surrendering yourself to that higher power. These programs, which have generally been as successful certainly as anything in helping people through addictions, one of the questions is, well, are they kind of transferring that addiction from one thing to another? Is there something physiologically going on that's similar? We don't have a defined answer yet, but we certainly know that religious and spiritual beliefs can often be a powerful mechanism by which people can get away from addictions. And you see this in rehabilitated criminals and so forth. They become deeply religious in prison or something like that. So oftentimes when people hit that proverbial rock bottom, they come out of it with a very intense spiritual belief system and spiritual experiences that transform the way they act and change the way they act so that they no longer have the addictive elements of that person, at least what they were doing before. So there are some really interesting aspects about this interrelationship. And again, another important area for neurotheology to look at.
Yeah, I can really see the substance addiction part of it, but couldn't we also say that this mechanism that you described, both in dopamine as well as the serotonin systems, is sort of behavior addiction that is happening in the brain, that somebody who is getting that high from a spiritual retreat would tend to do that more often than otherwise.
Yeah, no, I don't. I think it's not unreasonable to look at it in that kind of context. When people become deeply religious, it can look a lot like an addiction depending on the circumstances, and it raises another point about neurotheology and thinking about these kinds of topics, which is how do we define what is pathological and how do we define what is normal? So if you, I could ask you the same question, not you, but I could ask one the same question about playing a musical instrument, playing sports. There are people who play the violin hours and hours a day, and clearly it gives them some reward, and they become almost addicted to doing it. People can become addicted to exercise and so forth. So, but those may be good addictions, so to speak. And so if somebody does become a deeply religious individual, if it is something that leads them down a path that enables them to have an effective life, have a wonderful marriage, raise great children, be productive in society, then that's a good thing. If, on the other hand, it is an addiction that leads them to join some cult with 30 other people, and they commit violence or they kill themselves or whatever, then obviously that's a very negative thing. So it gets into a very kind of a bit of a quagmire, if you will, about, well, what is normal exactly? What amount of religious or spiritual beliefs are normal or not normal? What amount of any kind of beliefs are normal or not normal? And in looking at the political realm of today, how much anxiety and stress and depression on both sides arises because of the intensity of the beliefs and the desire to keep looking at the same pieces of information and going to the same sources. And there are some really there are certainly some parallels between all of these different things, and this to me is an area for us to kind of tease this out, which is where can we make that statement that religion is really has an element of addiction to it? Is that okay? What does that mean? Is it different than other types of addiction? And should it even be considered an addiction? So there are a lot of fascinating problems that we have to think about in terms of how we define these ideas and how we decide to define what normal is and what abnormal is, that we need to look at, and then look at what's going on in the brain itself in terms of how that all plays out.
Yeah, that's definitely an interesting point. So, one could argue that any activity done over and over again may result in this issue that we generally call addiction. And so the question then, Andrew, would be from a therapeutic intervention perspective, anytime we see excess dopamine in the brain from an activity, it's sort of indicating that, let me make a statement, you can correct me.
Okay.
Is it indicating that you're overdoing it?
Well, I don't necessarily think that it is overdoing it. I think that, I think, one always has to kind of look at it in context and whether or not, any activity, as you said, leads to something positive for an individual or ultimately leads them down a negative path. And, so many great artists are incredibly addicted, if that's the word where you're going with, to their art, whether it's music or painting. And of course, some of the greatest creative people have been highly tormented because of their how they engage their practice and how they engage it to the exclusion of many other things. So, but does that make them abnormal? Was Van Gogh abnormal or not? Was Mozart abnormal or not?
Right.
I mean, you can kind of argue it both ways. So,
or Einstein,
or
for
Einstein,
that matter.
yeah. And another interesting point about this, especially when it comes to some of the other points that we've talked about, is that if you're going to get into the study of religious and spiritual beliefs and attitudes and experiences, do you look at those individuals who are at the quote unquote highest level? Do we want to try to find the Mother Teresas? Do we want to find the Dalai Lamas and study them like we would study Mozart if we want to study music? Or do we look at the whole population of people and look at the range of people from very religious to very atheistic, and where are all the similarities and differences across that continuum? Just like if we wanted to study music, do we get the people who are like, really nice musicians to those people who are tone deaf? When we look at the overall normal population, that tells us a lot about what music is and how it intersects with the human brain. But it's also not exactly the same thing as studying Mozart's and Beethoven's brain. These are people who have music at a whole other level than the rest of us. And there's always, in every domain of human activity, there's always the athletes and the musicians and the artists and so forth that are just different from everybody else. And, is it just the normal along a continuum and they just happen to be on the far end of the continuum? Or is there some sort of quantum leap, if you will, that means it takes a person to a completely other level of thinking about things? And again, is that the right way or the wrong way of thinking? I mean, is Mozart's brain what we should strive for? Is that the enlightenment that we should strive for? I don't know.
Right. Yeah, that's a really interesting area. I want to finish up with one of your other papers, Andrew, the varieties of self-transcendent experience. Various forms of self-loss, you say, have been described as aspects of mental illness, but might self-loss also be related to mental health, you ask? And so you have sort of detailed different experiences here. You want to very quickly sort of summarize what they are?
Well, I mean, certainly there are, so many aspects of what are called, self-transcendent experiences. And there are ways, to me, there's really, and we've kind of touched on this at various points, that there's sort of this whole continuum of these experiences. We go from where we are in our everyday world to a feeling of love with a family member, to getting into these religious and spiritual experiences that have a profound sense of connectedness or oneness to a group or to God or to the universe. And of course, some of the even some of the great scientists have had experiences of these kinds of self-transcendent experiences, being connected to the scientific world, the physical world, in a way that we recognize that we're all deeply interconnected. So that these are some of the questions that we were looking at. This goes back to our survey of people's experiences, and again, when one gets beyond the ego self, these experiences become quite intense and become quite meaningful for the individual. And there do seem to be different types, if you will. So we started to look into, can we differentiate a God experience from feeling connected to the universe, feeling and how does that compare to a feeling of just oneness of all things? So there are a lot of different kinds of experiences that can be part of a larger continuum. And I think, again, trying to understand them, trying to understand how they affect the brain in different ways, how they affect the person in different ways, and what their meaning is in terms of each person's life. These are all the kinds of questions that we can start to ask.
Yeah. You mentioned mindfulness, flow, peak experiences. I knew mindfulness, but do you want to just give a quick definition of what you mean by mindfulness, flow, and peak experiences?
So, well, mindfulness tends to be more of the definition of mindfulness, so to speak, is to just be sort of presently aware of what's going on. So wherever you are, whatever you're experiencing, you're just aware of it in that present moment. Ideally, you are supposed to be non-judgmental about that. So you're just experiencing the world. And that's really what mindfulness is. Flow experiences, there's a pretty well-known scholar named Csikszentmihalyi, who, a very tough word name to spell, and he talks a lot about flow experiences that basically in this is where like so much information is being processed that you just feel like the world is sort of flowing through you. So it's a little different than mindfulness in that regard, and they tend to occur a little bit more often in very intensive types of states. People talk about this in surfing, jet pilots and things like that, who are just processing millions of pieces of information moment by moment, and they have that kind of flow experience. And then you have peak experiences, which also can be defined as just very, very intense experiences that sometimes can have an element of mindfulness, an element of flow, but they can be, there can be other elements to them. And this is actually, even touching on a larger question in neurotheology, which is, how do we use any of these words, and how do we compare the use of these words in those people who are having these experiences? If somebody says, I felt a feeling of flow, I felt God, I felt energy, I felt a force, are they the same experiences using different words, or are they fundamentally different kinds of experiences? And this is part of what we're trying to unwrap as we look at the descriptions, and also when we look at what's going on in the brain itself.
Yeah. So from my bias, Andrew, I'm thinking that these are all tools that might allow people to process information differently. And it might, it turn out to be sort of necessary condition for survival in the future, because we're moving into, a regime where you have much, much higher amount of information, and most of it is not going to be that useful to you, actually. And so, how do you discard information? How do you focus on the most important aspects, and really, sort of live through time in the most optimum fashion, right? All these sound like tools that people could utilize.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. As you said, as we get to more and more information, and who knows where we will ultimately end up with our kind of blending of our brain and our technology, and will we someday have chips that'll be instead of going to our phone, we'll just blink our eyes and suddenly we're searching for a good restaurant or something like that. So being able to process all of that information in different ways can be very, very important. And again, it gets back to one of the points I made earlier on, which is that the ultimate goal of so many of the spiritual traditions, and I think of science itself, is helping humanity get beyond where we are today to something bigger and better. And whether that is a scientific enlightenment, a spiritual enlightenment, whatever that means, or some combination of those two, I think there are really some wonderful opportunities for us to figure out the most effective ways of helping humanity on both an individual as well as a global level, trying to get to those next stages. And we'll see how they all go, and where humanity will evolve to, and whether or not our brain itself will continue to evolve into something different that will enable us to see the world in another kind of way, or see consciousness in another kind of way, or whether we'll just use our technologies to push us forward. Great questions, and we'll just have to see where the future takes us.
Yeah, keeping an open mind
very
appears
important
to be one important thing.
I mean, this to me I wrote a book called Principles of Neurotheology, and I talk about something I call the passion for inquiry, which is to just keep asking questions, to not, to keep, as you said, an open mind, to be aware of our biases. I mean, we all have to have our beliefs. We all have to, we all have to survive and make sense out of the world, but to also be open to what the other possibilities are. And, again, that even in and of itself is another just incredible question about, how much data do we need to change the way we think? If you're a very, staunch Republican, how much data do you need to become a Democrat, or vice versa? How do we think about these things, and how do we help everyone kind of work towards a greater understanding of themselves and the world around us? And that, to be throwing my idealistic self, I mean, that's really where I hope all of this takes us. But having that open mind, always forcing the more questions and asking more questions, and being aware of our own beliefs and biases, hopefully will take us there. And we just got to keep doing it, and hopefully we do it together. I think that's another real issue that we've just gotten away from, and hopefully we will figure out the ways of bringing ourselves together in effective ways.
Yeah, we have to be optimistic. Yeah, excellent. This has been great, Andrew. Thanks so much for spending time.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me on the program. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
This is a Scientific Sense podcast providing unscripted conversations with leading academics and researchers on a variety of topics. If you'd like to sponsor this podcast, please reach out to info@scientificsense.com.